Hello again, internet friends, and welcome back to another episode of Trust the Science. I'm your host, Neil deGrasse Tyson. This week, I want to talk to you guys about conditioning your hands, specifically for the purpose of landing punches on hard surfaces. Why and under what circumstances you might need to land a punch on a hard surface is none of my business, but you can use your imagination. In most situations that you would find yourself in where you need to throw some punches, it is unlikely that your hands will be wrapped and safely placed inside 16 to 20 ounce boxing gloves, and it is also unlikely that the surface you're going to be striking against is going to be a nicely padded punching bag. And so we want to prepare our hands to handle the stress of those impacts as much as we can so that we can hopefully lower the chance of us getting an injury if we do need to throw punches. But also, we want to train in a manner that's sustainable. We don't want to rip open our knuckles every single week when we try and hit the punching bag because we're not using gloves or wraps, because that's not really sustainable and everything's soaked in blood and your knuckles are constantly ripped open. We don't want you to go excessively hard and just try and wail on the hardest part of the punching bag or the hardest surface that you possibly can right away. And so I want to walk you guys through some very simple steps that you can use to build yourself up from not doing anything with the punching bag at all to being able to essentially throw your most powerful punches at the hardest part of the bag, which is the bottom. Now, there are a lot of old school martial artists who like to hit maybe a plank of wood or several pieces of leather that are attached to a piece of wood, some type of surface that's really, really rigid. I think there is a lot of value to that, and it's actually a good tool that I think everyone should use if they're interested in this type of conditioning. But utilizing the punching bag, I think, offers you some benefits that something harder like a plank of wood cannot. If you've ever tried to condition your hands on that really hard and unforgiving surface, you'll find that even if you build yourself up to being able to strike it relatively hard, you can't throw yourself into the punch the same way you would on a punching bag or if you were sparring. You can't rotate and follow through with your shoulder. You can't really whip your punches on it just because it's so hard and so unforgiving that if you really threw with 100% intention, you would most likely hurt your hand. And so while I think that type of conditioning is good and you should do it if you're interested in doing this type of thing, the punching bag is a few steps down and you still get the benefits of hardening your hands and your knuckles and your wrists, but in a way that allows you to throw with more power so that you're really challenging your shoulders, your triceps, your biceps. You're forcing your body to work together a little bit more, and it's straining your cardio a lot more, as opposed to these hard surfaces where you're really testing the strength and durability of the hand, but you're not able to challenge the system as a whole quite as much because you're only throwing with 10%, 40%, 50% of your power. And so as far as bang for your buck, I think the heavy bag is probably the best way to go because it offers more versatility, more options, and it challenges your whole body, your cardiovascular system, your arms, your shoulders, and your hands instead of just your hands like one of those hard boards would. The first and most common sense step is just hitting the punching bag consistently. You guys should be using wraps. You should be using gloves. I wouldn't be too concerned about the size of the glove other than to say just get, a boxing glove with a reasonable amount of padding in it. That way you can protect your hands, keep your knuckles from getting ripped open. And just doing that and practicing consistently every single week, trying to throw hard, fast punches, that will condition your hand if you're new to this type of workout. And for those of you who are maybe not comfortable throwing punches, or you're not familiar with basic technique of how to throw a punch or land a punch, go on YouTube. I mean, there's so many tutorials from every type of fighter. MMA fighters, boxers, bare knuckle boxers are becoming much more popular now. There's a ton of athletes out there who are posting YouTube video after video demonstrating how they like to throw a punch, how they like to land a punch. Everybody's got little variations to their style. So what I would recommend is, after you've established some consistency with your training with the punching bag, find a fighter that you like, watch a UFC fight or a boxing fight, and see what style is appealing to you, and then try and find that fighter on YouTube, because it's very likely that they've got a video somewhere of them demonstrating some basic punching technique. And that's really, really important, because as much as we want to condition the actual tissues in the hand, if you're throwing punches in a really funky manner and you're kind of landing on your fingers a lot, which is very common for people to do, as opposed to landing kind of squarely on your knuckles, that could potentially lead to some problems and you could hurt yourself there. And so we don't want to have you practice wrong punching form out of the gate. We're not looking to be Floyd Mayweather, but you do want your hand landing in a good position so that we're not practicing landing punches that are actually going to be putting the stress of the punch's impact mostly on your fingers, or potentially even worse, punching in a position where your wrist is bent forward or backward or off to the side in some strange way, where it's not going to be stacked up against your wrist and your elbow properly, which if you're punching and you have a weird wrist angle, that could potentially lead to a broken hand or a broken wrist or something like that. So the point is, we want to practice with reasonably good form. We don't have to be technique nuts, but we want the position to be stable enough to where you can safely and consistently throw hard, fast punches on the bag, especially as we transition to hitting the harder parts of the bag at the bottom. So those are the first two steps. One, just train consistently every single week, making sure you're getting in at least a half hour to an hour with the bag. And then the second thing would be to ensure that you have some type of halfway decent form. The third thing is then moving on to actually worrying about where on the bag you're hitting, and you can start contemplating maybe hitting without gloves. All the punching bags that I've encountered are pretty much the same, unless you have some type of aqua bag or a bag that's really small and condensed. The average punching bag that you would buy from the store pretty much is the same all across the board. Near the top, it's going to be really, really soft and offer almost no resistance. And then in the middle, it's relatively firm, but pretty manageable for most people. And then somewhere closer to the bottom, it gets pretty rock hard, especially after the first few uses and the stuffing and the padding inside starts to settle in the bottom. And something that I like to do is kind of take a mental note of, this is the top portion of the bag, this is the middle, and this is the bottom, because sometimes when you get into it, you're not really thinking about that and you're just kind of wailing on the bag wherever is most convenient. But I like to make a mental note of that so I can be a little bit more purposeful with my training. And you can even take a Sharpie and draw little lines to kind of help you distinguish which parts of the bag are hard and which parts of the bag are soft. I would not recommend using tape, because that often leads to little creases being formed in the bag, which can contribute to rips over the long term. But whether you just take a mental note or actually draw on the bag with Sharpie, it's good to have those distinct sections of the bag in your head. That way you can work your way down gradually if this is not something that you've done before. And so once you get a couple of months under your belt of just hitting the softest section of the bag, whatever's most comfortable, then you can start to work your way down to the second portion, where you should be able to notice, okay, this section's a lot harder, my hands are a little bit more sore and a little bit more tender after I'm done with the workout, especially the next day, but it's still something that's manageable. My hands aren't in pain. I can just feel that they're sore, I can feel that they're tired, my fingers are a little bit beat up from punching on the bag. And then over time, hopefully you'll be able to notice that my hands aren't quite as sensitive hitting this middle section of the bag. It's still pretty rigid, but it feels more like how I felt when I was hitting the softer section. And that generally means that you're ready to transition to the bottom one with gloves on still. And so these timelines are kind of arbitrary. If you're a little bit older, or if you just don't have a sports background and you're not a very physical person, work your way down really slowly. Give your tissues, your muscles, bones, and tendons time to adapt to the stress, especially because we're talking about the stress of impact, not just lifting, like pressing and putting things down. So it is a very stressful impact on your hands, and you want to give yourself time to adapt. If you're young or some type of tough guy or whatever, and you don't want to be as gradual, that's fine. But at the very least, I would say give yourself a couple of weeks so that your hand has time to adjust to the hardness of the bag. And then once you've got a couple of weeks under your belt of being able to really chop away at that harder bottom section of the bag, and you feel confident and your wrists and hands are feeling strong and you don't think you're running into any problems, then you're probably ready to transition to just punching the bag with wraps. Having said that, I pretty much never do bare knuckle on the bag unless I'm going relatively soft, because most of the time the skin on my knuckles will rip open and I just don't want to deal with that. I don't want to get an infection, and obviously I don't want to bleed on things. And so I've found in my experience that you can get most of the benefit of hitting the bag bare knuckle while still having wraps on and just not have your skin rip open. So for me, there's not really a downside to punching the bag with wraps. But when you do start hitting the bag with only wraps, then you're going to want to move back to the top of the bag where it's very soft, and you're going to want to give yourself some time to adjust your technique a little bit, because you'll find in those big boxing gloves, it's almost like you have a little stick in your hand, and most boxing gloves do have an actual little styrofoam pad that goes down the middle of the glove, and you can actually grip that, and allows you to hit much harder. When you're actually just clinching a bare fist with nothing but a few layers of wrap in your hand, it becomes a lot more important for you to clench your fist really, really tightly when you're trying to throw punches without the glove. And so in addition to just being aware of making sure you clench your fist, keeping that reasonably good technique, you're going to want to start again that process over where you're hitting the top of the bag where it's at its softest. But just like you did with the gloves, you'll eventually work your way down to hitting the bag with only wraps on the most rigid parts of the bag, including the very bottom. And this is something, again, you're going to really want to take your time with and be cautious with. I've thrown punches with just wraps, and I'm, getting into it and the music's playing, and I'll throw a punch at a weird angle and it does hurt my wrist a little bit. So you want to be careful and really make sure you're taking your time with this so you don't derail your training. And then the final note that I want to leave you guys with is, even when you get to that point that you can hit the hardest parts of the bag with just your wraps on or even bare knuckle, I still would recommend varying the intensities of your workout. Even though I can wail away at the bottom of the bag with only my wraps on because I've been doing this for years, I still don't spend a whole hour doing that. One, because the skin will usually rip open if I hit hard enough and long enough, even if I'm landing my punches squarely and I'm not like grinding the skin of my knuckles against the bag, it'll still rip open eventually. If you're strong enough and you hit hard enough, that's just going to happen. And kind of a final note that I want to leave you guys with is to remember that even when you get to the point where you can hit the bottom of the bag as hard as you possibly can with no gloves on and just wraps, I would still vary the intensity of your workouts. You don't need to spend a whole hour or more, or even a half an hour, wailing at the hardest part of the bag with only wraps on. One, because like I said before, it will rip your knuckles open eventually. I've tried this many times before. Even if you have very good technique and you're landing your knuckles squarely on the bag and not grinding the skin against the bag, if you hit hard enough for long enough, the skin generally will open up. It's just not meant to withstand that type of impact over and over for an hour of heavy bag work. Not to mention that in the same way you wouldn't come in and do a max effort deadlift or squat every single week, because it's just not sustainable and it's not something that you can recover from, and it's probably going to lead to injury or pain at some point. I would also carry that mentality over to this. Think of hitting the bottom of the bag without gloves on as max effort work, something that you do once in a while, maybe every week, but you do it very sparingly for a short period of time. And to give you a quick idea of what one of my heavy bag workouts will look like, initially I'm mostly worried about cardio, and I'm worried about technique and trying to throw punches in the same way that I would in a fight. And so I'm hitting the medium and upper portion of the bag where it's very soft, not necessarily because I love hitting that softer portion, but because I'm trying to hit the punching bag as if I was aiming at a taller opponent. And so I would recommend that, because if you can get used to throwing at a taller opponent, throwing at a shorter opponent is going to be a lot easier rather than trying to train the other way around. And so during that half hour to 45 minutes, I'm more focused on cardio, technique, throwing combinations, that type of thing. And then near the end of the workout, once I've really maxed that out and tired myself out, I can worry more about throwing really hard power punches and conditioning my hands and that type of thing. And so after I am done with that first half hour to 45 minutes, I will then start throwing a lot harder, but I'll throw single punches or 2 punches at a time, so I can focus a little bit more on hitting the bag as hard as possible, really popping my punches and trying to be fast. And I will drill specific punches over and over and over again. And in that time, I will generally stick in the area that's medium to hard on the bag. And then when I'm done with that, I will then take off the gloves and I will hit the bag with just wraps. And even then, I'll kind of start in the middle where it's a little softer, and I'll work my way down to the harder portions. So throughout the workout, you can see the intensity as far as the stress on my hands is fluctuating quite a bit. I'll start off easy and go harder and harder and harder, and then I'll kind of reset and go easy, harder and harder and harder, based on whatever the goal of that time period is, or whether or not I have gloves on or not. So sorry the video is so long. I will try and make a shorter one in the future that's maybe a little bit more succinct, but hopefully that's helpful to you guys. The punching bag is such a great tool, and it's so underappreciated and underutilized. I highly recommend taking the time to go out and get one. Get yourself a halfway decent pair of gloves and some wraps, and you're going to have a lot of great workouts ahead of you. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.